Steve Harvey held a secret about Michael Jackson for 20 years that has the potential to alter public perception. He didn't discuss it on the radio, didn't bring it up on television or in the books in which he divulged his darkest secrets. However, something broke him at age 69. And what he ultimately disclosed is not only startling, but also heartbreaking. Steve witnessed something the rest of the world never saw. When Michael Jackson called him in tears, he was present. When the man in charge of sold-out stadiums was unable to hold a cup of coffee without his hands shaking, he was there. He also overheard a confession that Michael had never made in public. Steve kept this truth to himself while the media, accusers, and documentaries changed the course of history. Steve said in a heavy, broken voice, "I saw the exact moment he broke. And everything is changed by what he told me that day and what I saw firsthand." However, why did Steve remain silent during the attacks if he was aware of the truth all along? When the world was crucifying him, why didn't he stand up for his friend? And 20 years later, what finally compelled him to speak up? His 12-year-old granddaughter's question upon returning home from school holds the key to the solution. Was Michael Jackson a bad man, Grandpa Steve? Steve became aware that a whole generation was being raised on false information, and he was unable to put up with it any longer. But first, we must go back to the beginning to understand why Steve finally spoke up. To the beginning of it all. To the first encounter between the world's most famous man and an unknown comedian. And amid the tumult of celebrity, an unlikely friendship emerged. The majority of people are unaware that Michael Jackson and Steve Harvey first met in 1993. Steve was still working hard backstage at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, performing stand-up comedy and attempting to establish himself. As the world's largest entertainer, Michael was already a god. But he had returned to the Apollo, the place where he'd performed as a child with the Jackson 5 for a private event honoring black excellence in entertainment. Steve can recall every aspect of that evening. He recently acknowledged that he was extremely anxious. You must realize that Michael Jackson was more than just a well-known figure. He was legendary. You didn't approach him and shake his hand as though he were an ordinary person. However, Steve was taken aback by what transpired in unexpected ways. It was Michael, not his bodyguards or handlers, who came up to him first. While Michael himself wearing a red jacket with military-style gold braiding, a look that would become iconic just months later. "You're Steve Harvey," Michael said quietly, his voice having that recognizable high pitch. "I've looked at your work. You're real, but you're also funny. That is uncommon." Steve was taken aback. Michael Jackson was aware of his identity. A struggling comic still making ends meet on the Chitlin circuit. Steve remembered, "I was at a loss for words. I probably smiled too much as I stood there looking foolish." However, Michael didn't appear to be aware of or concerned about Steve's anxiety. Rather, he took an entirely different action. He inquired about Steve's early years. "Where were you raised? What was it like?" Michael inquired. Michael's eyes changed when Steve told him about Cleveland, how impoverished he was, how his father worked as a coal miner, and how he used to sleep in his car. They became piercingly focused. Michael said, "You would understand struggle." Stated. Real struggle, not the kind people do to win sympathy. It was a 20-minute conversation. Steve's 20 minutes seemed like a single breath and an eternity. They discussed expectations, being black in entertainment, and the pressure to represent a whole community whether you wanted to or not. Finally, Michael said something that Steve would never forget. "Steve, people are going to try to ruin you. They'll pursue you more as you gain success. However, you will survive if you remain loyal to yourself and resist the urge to change who you are to fit their wishes." I'm still learning that lesson. Your Steve didn't fully comprehend Michael's meaning at the time. Before the accusations, the trials, and the media-feeding frenzy that would take over Michael's life, this was 1993. Steve simply believed that Michael was being pensive, perhaps a bit suspicious due to years of living in a bubble. However, in retrospect, Steve sees that Michael was warning him and providing him with a survival guide that Michael was having trouble following. After that initial encounter, they continued to communicate occasionally. More than acquaintances, but not close friends. Occasionally, Michael would give Steve a late-night call just to chat. He had no desire to discuss entertainment or music. Steve disclosed that he wanted to discuss everyday topics, such as what people said in barbershops and what it was like to go grocery shopping. Since he had never experienced everyday life, he found it fascinating. Steve characterized those calls as bizarre. The world's most famous person called him at 2 a.m. from Neverland Ranch or a hotel in Monaco, asking him about his experiences taking his children to school or arguing with his wife over bills. According to Steve, he would question me with genuine curiosity rather than condescension, much like a scientist researching a foreign species. He wanted to know what it was like to be normal. However, Steve didn't realize until years later that there was more to those conversations, something darker. Steve said, his voice laden with insight, Michael was lonely. Not just lonely, but terribly, terribly lonely. He was constantly surrounded by people, including fans, staff, managers, and assistants. But he didn't really know anyone. He was the object of everyone's desire. Even those who professed to love him had their own agendas. Steve remembered one particular conversation. Michael had recently wed Lisa Marie Presley in 1995. The tabloids were having a field day, claiming that it was a publicity stunt and a phony marriage intended to repair Michael's reputation following the 1993 accusations. Steve expected Michael to sound pleased when he called to congratulate him. Rather, Michael sounded worn out. Michael questioned, "Do you think it's real? My marriage. Do you think people think it's real?" Steve was at a loss for words. Does their opinion matter? When he did say it, Michael chuckled, but not in a joyful way. It was resigned and bitter. Steve, it matters what they think of everything. Everything I say and do is filtered through their preconceived notions about me. They would claim it was a special effect if I showed them my heart. Steve realized then just how much of a prison Michael was living in. Something worse than a real prison. A prison of narrative, perception, and a world that had predetermined Michael Jackson's identity and would not accept anything that went against it. Steve clarified that he was no longer a person to them. He was a symbol and a character, and symbols are not human. Unexpectedly, the friendship grew stronger. Michael personally, rather than through an assistant, wrote Steve a handwritten note in 1996, when his career took off with The Steve Harvey Show. "Congratulations on your success," the note read. "Don't let them alter who you are." A pause from Cleveland. Despite its simplicity, Steve carried that note in his wallet for many years. They always gravitated toward one another in celebrity-filled rooms, and they occasionally crossed paths at industry events. Steve observed that Michael appeared different in person than his public persona indicated. According to Steve, the media presented him as this strange, eccentric figure. He was thoughtful, intelligent, and profoundly spiritual when you sat with him and spoke with him. Of all the people I knew, he spoke about God the most. He had faith in redemption, love, and healing. He simply no longer thought he was capable of doing those things. However, everything changed in 2003. When the second round of accusations surfaced and Martin Basher's documentary came out, the world turned against Michael Jackson in a way that even his detractors found shocking. Additionally, Steve Harvey saw something that he hasn't spoken about for the past 20 years. Steve whispered, "I saw him break. Break completely. And what I saw at the time, what he told me, and what I saw firsthand, I have to tell people about that now because the truth counts. It did every time." In February 2003, Martin Basher's documentary Living with Michael Jackson aired, sparking the start of the 2003 crisis. Like millions of people worldwide, Steve Harvey was watching from his home in Los Angeles. Steve's phone rang before the show even ended, though, in contrast to most viewers. Michael was there, and he was in tears. Even after all these years, Steve's voice was still impacted by the memory, "I've never heard a grown man sound so broken." He insisted, "They deceived me. Steve. I had faith in him. He deceived me after I allowed him into my house and my life." Right then, Michael wasn't upset. He felt devastated and betrayed in a way that was more painful than any hit piece from a tabloid. For those who don't recall, the Basher documentary was meant to be Michael's resurgence, his opportunity to steer his own story after years of strange headlines and growing conjecture about his peculiarities. Respected British journalist Bashir had spent 8 months with Michael, recording private moments at Neverland Ranch, talking about his upbringing, career, and beliefs while capturing Michael with his kids. Michael believed he was being heard at last. Rather, Basher altered the video to portray Michael as dangerous, eerie, and delusional. In the most damaging scene, Michael was seen holding hands with Gavin Arzo, a young cancer patient, and claiming he allowed